Fine, then I'll start. So I'm supposed to be delivering a lecture on gastroesophageal junction tumors today. So the discussion will be under the following headings. What exactly do we mean by gastroesophageal junction? What are the etiology of these tumors that occur in the gastroesophageal junction? So a brief word about pathology and clinical features. How do we go about diagnosing and staging these tumors, and coming to the surgical treatment of those tumors which are non-metastatic. So coming to the introduction, gastroesophageal junction obviously is the area where the tubular esophagus joins a more saccular stomach. Unfortunately, the exact area, if we take it as an area beyond just the single line of junction of the esophagus and stomach, this has been defined in various ways. When a medical gastroenterologist does an endoscopy, he defines the gastroesophageal junction in a different way. When a physiologist does a manometric study to define the function of the lower esophagus, he defines the gastroesophageal junction in another way. And a surgeon during operation defines the gastroesophageal junction in another way. So there are various definitions, and all of them are not exactly coinciding with each other. So the most commonly used definition is an endoscopic definition, where the endoscopists see the upper limit of the gastric rugal folds, and they take that as the gastroesophageal junction endoscopically. Endoscopically, there is another important landmark, that is the transition between the whitish, more pale white squamous epithelium of the esophagus and the more reddish columnar mucosa of the stomach, which is slightly velvety and reddish in appearance. This is known as the Z line. Now, the gastroesophageal junction, which is marked by the upper end of the gastric rugal folds disappearing into the esophagus, and the Z line, they don't correspond to each other always. Mostly, the Z line is slightly higher, a few millimeters higher than the gastroesophageal junction as demarcated by the end of the or the upper limit of the gastric rugal folds. So that you have to be careful about. That the Z line is not exactly the gastroesophageal junction. The upper limit of the gastric fold, gastric mucosal folds, is the endoscopic gastroesophageal junction. So this is the Z line, you can see, whereas the gastroesophageal junction would be here, but the Z line is here. And this is slightly wavy. This is a normal irregular Z line. Z line may be very regular or it may be slightly irregular. This does not mean that there is some abnormality. Surgeons, as I said, identify the gastroesophageal junction during the surgery by the angle of His, which is the actual point of union of the tubular esophagus to the stomach. And tumors of the gastroesophageal junction may originate in the esophagus or in the cardia of the stomach, which is the proximal 2 centimeters of the stomach. And stomach cancers obviously are adenocarcinomas arising from the glands. Most esophageal tumors of the lower end, which involve the gastroesophageal junction, are also adenocarcinoma. How they become adenocarcinoma? They generally arise in a Barrett's esophagus, Barrett's columnar lined esophagus, which is a metaplastic change which occurs in the lower part of the esophagus. But rarely, lower end esophageal tumors can also be squamous. But mostly, gastroesophageal junction tumors, whether arising from the stomach and involving it, or whether arising from the lower esophagus and involving it, they are mostly adenocarcinomas. So what are the risk factors for development of gastroesophageal junction adenocarcinomas? I am specifying that this is the risk factor for adenocarcinoma. All of these are not true for squamous carcinomas which occur in the lower esophagus. So the most important risk factor in today's world, in the Western world, is GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. This ultimately leads to a metaplastic change in the lower esophagus, which is known as Barrett's esophagus or Barrett's columnar lined esophagus, because the lower esophagus, normally the mucosa should be a squamous epithelium, but in response to the repeated acid reflux into the lower esophagus, or even sometimes bile reflux, the esophageal mucosa undergoes metaplastic change. I hope you understand the definition of metaplasia. It is the replacement of one normal adult epithelium by another epithelium, which is a permanent change. This is known as metaplasia. Obesity is a risk factor for development of GE junction adenocarcinoma. Smoking is an important risk factor. However, alcohol is not a risk factor for development of adenocarcinoma of GE junction. For lower esophageal squamous or esophageal squamous cancers, alcohol intake is a risk factor, but for adenocarcinomas, it is not a risk factor. Presence of hiatal hernia Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, obviously, because it causes more acid reflux and more symptoms of GERD. So obviously the risk will increase. Achalasia cardia is an uncommon but definite cause of lower esophageal adenocarcinoma. It is also a cause for squamous carcinoma. And westernized diet, which are rich in animal fats, which are rich in more of saturated fats and have less of vegetables and fruits, are also known to be associated with a higher risk of development of gastroesophageal junction adenocarcinomas. I have already mentioned that alcohol does not increase the risk of adenocarcinomas, and unlike typical gastric cancers, which are often associated with H. pylori infection, GE junction tumors are not associated with H. pylori infection. Rather, H. pylori infection has an inverse correlation with lower esophageal or lower esophageal adenocarcinomas, which involve the GE junction. So, a few words about Barrett's esophagus, since it is a very, very important risk factor for development of lower esophageal adenocarcinoma or GE junction adenocarcinoma. Barrett's esophagus is a condition where the normal squamous epithelium of the distal esophagus is replaced by metaplastic columnar epithelium, and it is most commonly a sequelae of chronic GERD. It is diagnosed mainly endoscopically by the presence of a salmon-colored gastric mucosa, which is 1 centimeter or more above the GE junction. As I have already told you, for a few millimeters above the GE junction, there may be a normally appearing prolongation of the gastric mucosa. But if it is, say, almost a centimeter, it can be definitely seen. Then it is labeled as columnar lined esophagus. And that's known as Barrett's esophagus. But the final diagnosis is by taking a biopsy. You have to take a biopsy and you have to prove that it is the gastric metaplastic auxentic epithelium that has developed in the esophagus. So the diagnosis is by endoscopy, but histopathological confirmation is essential. You have to have a biopsy proven. Just the appearance of the velvety esophagus is not enough. That is enough for suspicion. That is enough for endoscopic diagnosis. But to confirm the diagnosis, you have to take a histopathological biopsy from there to show gastric type of mucosa there. And if it is a long-standing Barrett's and if it is a longer segment Barrett's, then the chance of dysplasia developing in this Barrett's esophagus is more. Long-term dysplasia again increases the risk of development of adenocarcinoma. So the treatment of Barrett's esophagus is anti-reflux measures. There can be medical treatment. You can give PPIs. You can put in surgical treatments for prevention of reflux. And patient has to undergo regular screening for dysplasia. If it is a short segment, then maybe the screening has to be every year. If it is a long segment Barrett's, we know that the risk of development of dysplasia is much more. So the endoscopic surveillance has to be more common, and every time the Barrett's mucosa is seen, biopsy has to be taken to see whether dysplasia is developing. Dysplasia is again divided into low-grade dysplasia and high-grade dysplasia. Low-grade dysplasia, the risk of progressing to high-grade is less, or the risk of developing malignancy is less, but it is there. So nowadays, it is also treated with radiofrequency ablation if you have the facility. If not, you continue the anti-reflux measures and continue screening. High-grade dysplasia has a very, very high risk of development of adenocarcinoma, so it has to be treated. In most of the Western world where the facility is present, high-grade dysplasia is treated by endoscopic methods, that is endoscopic mucosal resection. That entire area which is dysplastic and showing Barrett's-like esophagus or Barrett's-like mucosa is excised endoscopically and it is sent for histopathological evaluation. Now we come to the actual GE junction tumor. Traditionally, Sievert's classification was the one which was used most commonly for GE junction tumor. Although other classifications are also there, like the Japanese follow something known as a Nishi's classification. But in the Western world and what we used to follow when we were students and even now, Sievert's classification is most commonly used. And Sievert divides gastroesophageal junction tumors into 3 types: type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 GE junction tumor is the one which arises in the lower esophagus, where the epicenter is within 5 centimeters of the GE junction, and it can extend into the GE junction, starting from above 1 centimeter from the GE junction to up to 5 centimeter up to the GE junction. This is type 1. The type 2 tumor is the actual GE junction tumor, which arises in a region demarcated by 1 centimeter above the GE junction and 2 centimeters below the GE junction. In this area, tumors arising are known as a type 2 GE junction tumor. And a type 3 GE junction tumor is a proximal gastric tumor, which the epicenter of which is beyond 2 centimeters of the GE junction into the stomach, but it is going to involve the GE junction. So this is a diagram which I hope will make it clear. So this is the lower esophagus. If any tumor is arising which is more than a centimeter away from the, I hope you can see my cursor. Is my cursor visible?
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Okay. If the tumor is arising more than a centimeter away from the GE junction, but it is within 5 centimeters of the GE junction, then it is a type 1 Sieverts. If the tumor is below 1 centimeter of the GE junction, but within distal 2 centimeters of the GE junction into the stomach, that tumor is a type 2 GE junction tumor, or Sieverts type 2. And a type 3 Sieverts tumor is one which arises beyond 2 centimeters of the GE junction into the stomach, but within 5 centimeters of the GE junction. This is a Sieverts type 3. However, nowadays, when we have to do staging of these cancers, AJCC, which is the most commonly followed staging manual, has clubbed the staging of GE junction tumors with esophageal cancers. So if you see the AJCC staging, you will see that the staging is, the heading of the chapter is esophageal and esophagogastric junction tumors. So the definition of GE junction has been slightly altered by AJCC. The 8th edition of AJCC includes GE or considers GE junction as only those tumors which are arising within 2 centimeters of the distal part of the GE junction, the endoscopic GE junction. Any tumors which are arising beyond, the epicenter of which is beyond 2 centimeters of the endoscopic GE junction, will not be considered to be a GE junction tumor according to AJCC classification. So Sieverts type 3, which was a tumor which arose beyond 2 centimeters of the endoscopic GE junction, that will not be considered to be a GE junction tumor for the purpose of staging only. You have to understand that this is just for the purpose of staging. If you have a tumor there, that tumor will still remain a Sieverts type 3. You will still have to manage it according to a Sieverts type 3 management. But for the staging purpose, it will be considered to be a gastric cancer, and it should be staged according to the staging of gastric cancer. But tumors which are within 2 centimeters, distal 2 centimeters of the GE junction, are to be staged as an esophageal cancer. And so this is what has been written in this. The esophagogastric junction is redefined. Adenocarcinomas whose epicenter is no more than 2 centimeters into the gastric cardia are staged as esophageal adenocarcinoma. Any adenocarcinoma which is beyond 2 centimeters, which are extending further, they are staged as stomach cancer. And they go on to say that the genetic signature actually is more accurate in identifying the cell of origin for the purpose of staging rather than the gross location. And in the 9th edition of staging, we can expect more changes. Cancer genetics will be a subsequent focus. It will not just be an endoscopic localization. We'll also have to take a biopsy. We'll have to do a genetic study and show whether the mutations are corresponding more to esophageal cancer or the stomach cancer. And according to that, we will have to decide whether it is a esophageal or a stomach cancer. Just the endoscopic diagnosis that we are using now may not be sufficient in future. Anyway, that is in the future. So this is a diagram which shows the classical Sieverts type. This is the Sieverts type beyond 1 centimeter of the GE junction line up to 5 centimeters. Sieverts type 2 is within 1 centimeter of the esophagus and proximal 2 centimeters of the stomach. And type 3 is beyond 2 centimeters but within 5 centimeters of the proximal stomach. So now, according to 8th edition of AJCC, this type 1 and type 2 tumors are GE junction tumors, and they are to be considered to be staged as esophageal cancer. The staging of these type 1 and type 2 tumors is exactly the same as staging of esophageal cancer. And type 3 Sieverts is no longer considered to be GE junction tumor. It is to be taken as gastric cancer and staged according to gastric cancer. This is just for the purpose of staging, I am saying again, just the AJCC staging part. This is a diagram which is slightly more helpful in understanding the concept. So this is the tumor A, which is going on to involve the endoscopic GE junction line. But you can see that the epicenter is beyond 1 centimeter of the GE junction line in the lower esophagus, but within 5 centimeters. So this is a classical GE junction tumor. According to Sieverts, this is a type 1, and according to HSAC, this is a GE junction tumor. The B, you can see, is also involving the GE junction, the tumor B. It is crossing the line of the endoscopic GE junction. But since it is a big tumor and it is extending mainly into the stomach, the epicenter of the tumor is beyond 2 centimeters of the lower part of the GE junction, endoscopic GE junction. So although this is a GE junction tumor, according to AJCC staging, B is not a GE junction tumor. It is to be considered as a gastric cancer for the purpose of staging, only for the purpose of staging. For the purpose of treatment, obviously you will still have to consider it as a GE junction, as a Sieverts type 3, and manage it slightly differently than you would manage a typical proximal gastric cancer. But for staging purpose, this is no longer considered to be a part of GE junction tumor because the epicenter is more than 2 centimeters away. Type C, which is a smaller tumor, it crosses the GE junction and its epicenter is within the tube, within 2 centimeters of the lower part of the endoscopic GE junction, will again be considered a GE junction tumor. So tumor A is a GE junction tumor, tumor C is a GE junction tumor, but tumor B, which is quite similar to C, but it is extending beyond, and so its epicenter is more than 2 centimeters away, this will not be considered a GE junction according to AJCC for the purpose of staging. So now that we have decided that Sieverts type 1 and type 2 or GE junction tumors are to be staged according to the staging of CA esophagus, the management is also basically same as CA esophagus. So this is just a diagram to show you. So this is basically, it will be like lower esophageal tumors. The treatment of GE junction tumors mainly will be like lower esophageal tumors. A few words about surgical pathology. Since lower esophagus has got longitudinally oriented rich submucosal lymphatic channels, esophageal cancers tend to spread longitudinally for great lengths compared to the circumferential extent. So you need a large proximal margin. Unlike for other gastrointestinal tumors like colon, where you 5 centimeters enough, for stomach 5 centimeters are enough. For esophageal cancers, a proximal margin of 5 centimeters is not enough. You may have extensive submucosal spread of the tumor. And because they've got rich submucosal lymphatics, even T1B tumors can assess the lymphatics. So lymph nodal involvement can occur very early in the lesion. And the lymph nodal stations that are involved may be far away from the primary tumor. So the implication is that even a lower end of the esophagus or a GE junction tumor may give rise to nodal metastasis in the upper mediastinum. So what are the clinical features of gastroesophageal junction tumors? Obviously, the most common clinical feature is dysphagia, which will be more to solids. But you must remember that dysphagia only starts to occur when 60% of the lumen is compromised. So it is not a very early feature. More early non-specific features are those symptoms of dyspepsia, symptoms of GERD. Sometimes there is a sticking sensation in the chest. Pain during swallowing is a very, very late feature and an ominous feature. If the patient is complaining of pain, then obviously surrounding structures have been involved. Again, advanced tumors, because of the chronic dysphagia and inability to eat, the patient may have anorexia, weight loss, anemia. Back pain, again, is a ominous feature and a sign of advanced cancer because generally the vertebral body or the nerves in the region of the posterior mediastinum have been involved. And of course, if it is metastatic, the patient may have symptoms and signs of metastasis. The most common sites of metastasis are obviously to the lungs, liver, brains, and bones. So now coming to, once you suspect a patient has got a lower esophageal or a GE junction tumor, what do you do? The most common presentation, as I said, is with dysphagia. So obviously, the first thing you do to evaluate a new onset dysphagia in a, say, elderly male patient who is also giving a history of smoking, who is obese, or who is giving a long-standing history of GERD, you ask for a flexible upper GI endoscopy, which is a white light endoscopy. What does it do? It will show you any lesion. Obviously, you will be able to visualize it directly. You can take a biopsy, which is the most important thing. Biopsy will tell you whether it is just a Barrett's esophagus, whether it's a Barrett's esophagus with this dysplasia, or whether it is a frank carcinoma. You can also note its position from incisors, which will tell you whether it is a Sieverts type 1, Sieverts type 2, or a Sieverts type 3. And you can do several add-ons like chromoendoscopy or narrow band imaging. Now, for a typical advanced cancer that we get, you don't have to do chromoendoscopy and narrow band imaging. But suppose you get a patient with non-specific GERD symptom and you do an endoscopy and you find a certain suspicious area. Now, these areas, you are not sure whether it is just a Barrett's esophagus or whether there are sites of dysplasia. It's a small area which is fairly widespread. Now, you cannot take biopsy from the entire region. You can take biopsy from 4 or 5 spots. So how to target the area of biopsy? I hope all of you have seen that a biopsy forceps is a very, very small thing. It goes through the working channel of the endoscope. So how to target your biopsy to identify any dysplasia that may be present. So for these, chromoendoscopy or narrow band imaging is very useful. They use certain techniques by which the areas which are more dysplastic become more prominent in an area of Barrett's. And so you can target the biopsy there and you can try to identify whether any dysplasia has already occurred, because that means that some sort of a surgical treatment will have to be done. Another investigation that used to be done much more before endoscopy was so widely available was a gastrographin swallow or a barium swallow. Nowadays, it is not so commonly used. There are very specific indications for it. If you have got a very stenotic lesion, that is more common in the mid esophagus or lower esophagus. GE junction tumors may not be so stenotic. But if you have a stenotic lesion and you cannot go into the stomach or you cannot assess the distal limit of the tumor, then you can use a gastrographin swallow to assess how far the lesion is and what is the condition of the stomach distal to the lesion. Or if there are certain small fistula, you are suspecting a fistula on endoscopy, but you can't really see the opening very well, then also you can do a gastrographin swallow and that will delineate a fistula with the tracheoesophageal tree, tracheobronchial tree. So narrow band imaging, a few words. We all know that white light, conventional white light has got a wavelength of 4,000 to 8,000 angstrom. But if you use specific wavelengths, then you get proper single color, not white light. So you use a filter to filter out all the other things so that only 400 to 430 nanometer wavelength light is allowed. This highlights the superficial capillaries. You can use a different filter which has got a slightly longer wavelength, which will penetrate more into the mucosa and show you the mucosal patterns of the pits or glandular pits or the deeper capillaries. And this allows the distinction between a normal mucosa, dysplasia, and early invasive cancer. Normal submucosa have got a definite pattern. When the cells become dysplastic, the capillary pattern or capillary branching pattern gets disturbed. And so you can identify it more easily by using narrow band imaging, which is just imaging using a specific wavelength of the white light, just one component of the white light, which allows you to highlight certain features like the branching of the submucosal capillaries or glandular architecture. This helps you to target your biopsy from suspicious areas. Now coming to staging of GE junction tumors. So this is the AJCC 8th edition for staging, and it is exactly like esophagus. So I'm not going to waste time. The chart is there. You can memorize it. You have to memorize this ideally. So I'll just draw your attention to one thing. T1 is further divided into T1A and T1B. T1A is where it is just up to the lamina propria or the musculus mucosa. The submucosa is not involved. So this is amenable to endoscopic therapy. If you are sure that you are just dealing with a T1A lesion, then just endoscopic resection of the lesion is enough. You don't have to do a full thickness resection. The incidence of lymph nodal metastasis is less than 5%. So you don't need to do an open surgery, just an endoscopy is enough. And also you should note that T4 is divided into T4A and T4B. T4B are those advanced tumors which involve adjacent structures like the aorta, the vertebral body or trachea. And obviously T4B is not resectable by definition. T4A tumors, you can do a resection, although they are advanced. But these are structures which are dispensable, which are resectable. And you can do an en bloc resection for a T4A tumor, but not for a T4B tumor. This is the lymph nodal status. You will again note that the N1, N2, and N3 distinction is on the basis of the number of nodes that are involved, not according to the site. And M0 and M1, obviously, you all know. I will not waste time. Let us go on to the staging morally. Now that we know that this is the stage, how do we stage the tumor? We have done an endoscopy. We know that there is a tumor in the lower esophagus which is involving the GE junction. We have taken a biopsy and that has come out to be adenocarcinoma. Now we want to know the T stage and the N stage and the M stage also. So the most important or the most accurate method of staging for GE junction tumors, especially early GE junction tumors, is something known as an endoscopic ultrasound, which is nothing but an ultrasound transducer which is attached to the tip of the endoscope. This is not a conventional endoscope. This is a slightly more specialized endoscope, but essentially it is a flexible endoscope. You also may need to do a CT scan of the thorax and abdomen. And nowadays, the standard recommendation is to do a whole body FDG PET CT scan, which is a fusion of FDG PET and a conventional CT scan. And if you have got a good quality CT scan machine fused to the PET machine, then you don't really need to do the CT scan of the thorax and upper abdomen, because that is being done anyway in the PET CT. So I'll come to that a little later. A few words about the endoscopic ultrasound. You can use a radial or a curvilinear echoendoscope. So normally for the staging purpose, you use a radial scope. It is much more easy to use. It provides a 360-degree view of the esophagus, and the USG transducer is covered with a fluid-filled balloon to eliminate the surrounding air pockets, and it improves acoustic coupling with the mucosa. But if you want to do an intervention like doing an FNAC of a periesophageal lymph node or a perigastric lymph node, then it is difficult to do it because the image is perpendicular to the tip of the scope, whereas the needle of the FNAC will go parallel to the tip of the scope. So you will not be able to image the tip of the needle very well. So for the purpose of intervention, you need a curvilinear echoendoscope, which gives you a curved end-on view. To a curvilinear endoscope, you get an end-on view and you can do the intervention better. But for staging just conventional viewing, visualization, a radial scope is better. So on cross-section, the esophageal wall appears to be 5-layered, alternating hyper and hypoechoic. The innermost layer is the interface between the balloon and the mucosa, which is hyperechoic. The second layer is the hypoechoic layer, which is the mucosal layer, essentially the muscularis mucosa. Remember that the muscle is hypoechoic. So the muscularis mucosa contributes to the mucosal layer being hypoechoic. Then you have submucosa, which is hyperechoic. Then you have muscularis propria, which is again hypoechoic. And the fifth layer is the adventitia. Remember that the esophagus does not have a true serosa. So it is just a fibrous adventitial covering. And that again gives rise to a hyperechoic layer. So these are the conventional alternative hyper and hypoechoic. And you can see that this is one area where this hyperechoic thing is being breached. So this layer is the muscularis propria layer, and this has been breached here by this tumor. So obviously it is a T3 tumor. And you can also see that periesophageal lymph nodes are visualized very nicely, and you can use the lumen to put in a needle and assess whether this is involved or not. So EUS is a very, very useful thing, but limitations of EUS are it is not widely available everywhere. Like most government hospitals in our state still don't have the facility for EUS. You cannot pass the endoscope through a very stenotic lesion in the lower esophagus again. So the contraindication for endoscopy is also the contraindication for EUS. And actually for GE junction tumor, which involves the GE junction and go into the stomach, EUS is not that accurate. Sometimes the staging can be a little inaccurate and it is subjective. Unlike for esophagus, where the staging is much easier. For the N and M stage, you need to do a CT scan of the thorax, abdomen, and pelvis. For MRI does not offer any special advantage. It takes longer to acquire the data. Data acquisition time is longer, so the patient swallows. And when there is swallowing, the esophagus moves up and down. And so there are motion artifacts. So MRI is not advised for staging of lower esophageal or esophagogastric junction tumors normally. FDG PET CT scan is recommended for all non-metastatic cases which are T2 and onwards. For a T1 lesion on upper EUS, you should not do an PET CT scan because the incidence of distant metastasis actually is very, very low. Whereas in a country like ours, you will get a lot of false positives on PET, which are just inflammatory disease. And then you will spend more time trying to FNA them or trying to prove that they are actually positive. Most of the time, they will turn out to be false positives. They are not true spreads. So for a T1 esophageal tumor seen on EUS, you need not do a PET CT scan. Just a CT scan of the thorax and upper abdomen is enough. But anything from T2 onwards, you should do a FDG PET CT scan to prove that it is not metastatic and to also identify the lymph nodal spreads. Because as I have told you, because of extensive longitudinally oriented submucosal lymphatics, even early lower esophageal tumors may have lymphatic involvement in the upper mediastinum, and we need to know that to formulate our treatment plan. Just a word about biomarkers. It is not very commonly done in our country, especially with poor people. These are expensive. The tests are expensive. The targeted therapy which are used on the basis of these tests are even more expensive. In our country, even now, not even 5% of the total population can afford these. But for your theory purpose, you should know that molecular testing for HER2 status, for MSI, and for programmed death ligand 1 expression are being done more and more for GE junction tumors, for proximal gastric tumors. And if they are positive, then you can use the certain molecules for treating them. Like, for example, if the patient is HER2 positive, then you can use trastuzumab as a part of the neoadjuvant therapy regime. But it is not very commonly done in our country. So it is more useful for advanced, unresectable, and metastatic lower esophageal and esophagogastric cancers. Now coming to the treatment. The treatment is essentially a multimodality treatment. Because I could not add that, I have mentioned it here. You should consider a staging laparoscopy as a part of a staging workup for a Sievert's type 3 lesion. For a Sievert's type 1 or a type 2 lesion, you need not do a staging laparoscopy. But for a Sievert's type 3 lesion, which is virtually like a gastric cancer, you should do a staging laparoscopy, especially if you are planning to do neoadjuvant therapy, so that accurate staging can be done. So this is a snapshot from the NCCN 2021 guidelines for esophageal cancers. I have taken from T1B onwards. You note T1A is not there in this. I have excluded T1A because T1A is very, very superficial. I have already mentioned that the treatment is endoscopy. I will show you one slide for it, but it is very unlikely that you will get T1A. So for all practical purposes, T1A is managed endoscopically. We don't ever see a T1A lesion. What we might get is a T1B onwards, and you will see that for clinical T1B and T2, that also T2 low risk lesions which are less than 3 centimeters in size and which are well differentiated and which are N0, you can go for upfront esophagectomy. For all others from T2, T3, T4, any N plus, you have to go for some sort of a neoadjuvant therapy. That can be neoadjuvant chemoradiation or definitive chemoradiation or neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So the management of GE junction tumors for all practical purposes is multimodality treatment by neoadjuvant therapy followed by surgery. Please don't say esophagectomy, first of all. Only for a T1V lesion, which you will never get in your life, or at least for the next 10 years, you will not get it. You do a esophagectomy upfront. For all other lesions, even if it is clearly resectable, the evidence is in favor of giving neoadjuvant therapy before going for surgery. Okay. So what are the neoadjuvant therapies that you will give? If it is a Sievert type 1 or a type 2 lesion, you can give neoadjuvant chemoradiation, radiation plus chemotherapy, which is on the basis of something known as a cross trial. I will not go into the details of it because I think as general surgery students, you don't need to know great details. You should know the name of this landmark trial, that is the cross trial. You should know that they use neoadjuvant radiation 41.2 gray. If you can remember it, very good. If you don't remember it, that's also all right. And along with that, they give weekly paclitaxel and carboplatin at a suitable appropriate dose. And after that, they downstage the tumor and then they go for surgery. And there is a significant survival advantage to using neoadjuvant radiation and chemotherapy followed by surgery as compared to only surgery. For a Sievert type 3 lesion or even for a Sievert type 2 lesion, you can go for a neoadjuvant chemotherapy, just chemotherapy, if chemoradiation is not possible, because chemoradiation does give rise to some amount of fibrosis and the subsequent surgery becomes difficult. Unless you have got a very good machine and a very good radiation oncologist who gives a very tight field, the subsequent surgery following the neoadjuvant chemoradiation becomes a little difficult. So you can also give neoadjuvant chemotherapy, and that is on the basis of this trial, which is known as the MAGIC trial. This is actually perioperative chemotherapy, and this trial was mainly for gastric cancers, but lower esophageal and GE junction tumors also constituted almost 25% of the patient population of the MAGIC trial. And so the results of the MAGIC trial are also applicable for lower esophageal adenocarcinoma or GE junction adenocarcinoma. And MAGIC trial has also shown a benefit, a survival benefit, if you use it before or around surgery as compared to surgery alone. So which one should we use? Should we use cross trial or should we use MAGIC trial basis? And so to my knowledge, there is no trial which has compared neoadjuvant chemoradiation versus neoadjuvant chemotherapy. So you can use any of the things depending on what is the facility available in your hospital, as long as you are using some sort of a neoadjuvant therapy and not directly going for esophagectomy. Okay. Both of them have been shown to show survival advantage. You cannot do cross-trial comparison and say, you cannot do comparison across trial. Cross-trial, I don't mean this cross-trial, means across trial. Suppose cross-trial showed a survival advantage of 30% or relative risk reduction of 30%. MAGIC trial showed a risk reduction of 22%. You cannot say cross-trial is better than MAGIC trial just because 30% is more than 22. These are different trials. So you cannot compare across trials. There has been no head-to-head randomized control trial comparing neoadjuvant chemoradiation versus neoadjuvant chemotherapy purely for GE junction tumor. So we don't know which is better. Whichever you feel can be done in your setup, you do. Both of them will give you survival advantage as compared to surgery alone. I will not go into the details of chemotherapy and all. This is for a T1A lesion that I said. If on endoscopic ultrasound, you are sure that you are dealing with a T1A lesion, you can just do endoscopic therapy, which is endoscopic mucosal resection or cryotherapy or even radiofrequency ablation. Only for TIAs, that is carcinoma in situ, and T1A tumors, that is involving only the lamina propria. The muscularis mucosa has not been involved. And they have to be, there are other criteria also. It has to be a well-differentiated tumor. It has to be small in size. There should not be any lymphovascular embolus. These are on the preoperative biopsy. It should be an exophytic type of lesion. It should not be an infiltrative lesion. And obviously, you need to have the expertise. Most centers in Kolkata or West Bengal still don't have facility for doing endoscopic mucosal resections of RFA. So it is mainly a theoretical discussion for the purpose of writing for theory exams. In practice, you will not get a T1A lesion. If you get a T1A lesion, you will not have the expertise to do endoscopic therapy. So you may have to do a surgery for this as well, conventional surgery. Coming to the radical surgery for more advanced lesion, anything more than T1A. So that is the mainstay of treatment in fit patients for T1B and a T2N0 lesion, as I told you, but T2N0, it has to be less than 3 centimeters. It has to be well differentiated. You can do an upfront surgery. What surgery? I will come to a little later. For T3, T4, T2, not fitting these criteria, and for any node positive, you should give some sort of neoadjuvant therapy. I've already told you there are two options. You can give neoadjuvant chemoradiation based on cross trial, or you can give neoadjuvant or perioperative chemotherapy based on MAGIC trial. So if you follow the AJCC staging and consider that only Sievert's type 1 and type 2 lesions are gastroesophageal junction tumors, then obviously the treatment is according to the treatment for esophageal cancers. And you can do a total esophagectomy, you can do a partial esophagogastrectomy, and if it is a Sievert's type 3, which is not a GE junction tumor according to the AJCC 8, then you can do a total gastrectomy with partial esophagectomy. Just a total gastrectomy will not do, total gastrectomy with partial esophagectomy. So what are the surgical issues? How much margin should we take? I have already discussed briefly. For esophagus, you need to have a proximal margin of 10 centimeters. For the distal margin, 5 centimeters are enough. If it is a well-differentiated tumor, you can take less than that, but you don't reliably know the differentiation or the grade, so it is safer to take 10 centimeters proximal. What are the approaches to get this? Do I go a transthoracic route? Do I do a thoracoabdominal route? Do I do a transhiatal route? Should I use a minimal access surgery? I will discuss that later. What is the extent of lymphadenectomy that needs to be done? And after resection, you have to reconstruct because you have removed a segment of the GI tract. You have removed the lower esophagus or the total esophagus part of the stomach. So you have to restore the continuity. So how do I do that? And when I'm restoring the continuity by some sort of bowel, what is the type of anastomosis that I do? So I will deal with them one by one. Sievert's type 1 and 2, I have already said you treat a esophageal cancer. So the surgery can be a total esophagectomy or a subtotal or partial esophagectomy. So the total esophagectomy can be a transthoracic total esophagectomy, which is the McKeown's operation, or it can be a esophagogastrectomy, where it's subtotal, where you can resect the esophagus up to the aortic arch or a little below the aortic arch, and leave the proximal esophagus or the upper esophagus in the thorax. That is known as the Ivor-Lewis operation. And you can do a transhiatal total esophageectomy, where you don't make a thoracic incision and you dissect out the esophagus from the abdomen and from the cervical part, and you remove the total esophagus. And in this case, the reconstruction has to be by a gastric tube or the colon. The left colon can be used, the right colon can be used. I'll come to that. What are the pros and cons of the different approaches? If you do a total esophagectomy, the advantages are obviously the proximal margin. It's a very wide margin. You get to do the anastomosis in the neck. It is a cervical anastomosis because the transection line is in the neck. So the chances of mediastinitis occurring from the leak from the anastomosis is less because it is a cervical anastomosis. But if you do an intrathoracic anastomosis, then if there is a leak, it will lead to a very deadly condition known as mediastinitis, infection or inflammation of the mediastinum, and that has a very, very high mortality rate. Mediastinitis, the mortality rate is almost to the tune of 30 to 40%. So almost half your patients will die if they develop a leak in the mediastinum. And obviously 3-field lymphadenectomy is possible if you do a total esophagectomy, because you're going right up to the neck and you're making a neck incision, so you can remove neck nodes. As I have told you, even lower esophageal cancers and GE junction cancers have cervical lymph node metastasis. Although the incidence is very low, but it is not zero. So Japanese surgeons who are aggressive, or Korean surgeons, they will like to do a 3-field lymphadenectomy even for a lower esophageal GE junction tumor, Sievert's type 1 or a type 2. They might do, or for at least type 1, they will do a 3-field lymphadenectomy. There are some disadvantages also. It is a more extensive operation. You need to make a thoracic incision, more pain. And for a lower third lesion, the margin is often too much. Suppose it's a very small Sievert's type 2 lesion. To do a total esophageectomy, you will end up getting almost 18 centimeters or 20 centimeters of proximal margin. You don't need 20 centimeters, 10 centimeters are enough. And because of the excessive mobilization of the conduit up to the neck and anastomosis are associated with a higher incidence of leak. Intrathoracic anastomosis leak less. But if they leak, the consequences are worse. Cervical anastomosis leak much more, but the consequences are not so bad. So it depends on your choice, your philosophy, whether you want to accept a higher incidence of leak, or you want to accept, or you want to go for a lower chance of risk, but a higher risk of mediastinum. Thank you. Cervical or mediastinal anastomosis. So there is a meta-analysis which has shown, obviously, which I told you, neck anastomosis has got a higher leak rate, 18% versus 4%, but the lower incidence of mediastinitis in case of cervical anastomosis. Recurrent laryngeal nerve injury is more in cervical anastomosis, but there is less incidence of biliary reflux. There is no significant difference in the rates of strictures or pulmonary complications or perioperative mortality. So ultimately, it is your choice. Whatever you are more comfortable with, you can do that. Coming to Sievert's type 3 lesion, which is not considered GE junction by AJCCA, but it is there. You can get a tumor like that, which is a Sievert's type 3. So what to do with it? Just saying that treating it as a gastric cancer and doing a total gastrectomy may not be enough, because it is going on to involve the GE junction. If you do a total gastrectomy, you are transecting the stomach. So you will get a margin positive. So you have to do something more than a total gastrectomy. You have to remove part of the lower esophagus. Now that may not be too much. You may get a 2 centimeter or 3 centimeter margin, and you may be able to manage that just by an abdominal approach. So you can treat it as a proximal gastric cancer. A better term would be to say you can treat it as a proximal gastric cancer. So the surgery is a total or a partial gastrectomy with lower partial esophageectomy. At least 4 or 5 centimeters of the esophagus you need to remove. If more esophageal involvement is there, then obviously you have to do something else. And you can do a transabdominal approach. If you think that the proximal extent is difficult to get transabdominally, then you can do a left thoracoabdominal incision through a left 9th rib space and transect the diaphragm, transect the intercostal tissue, and that way it gives you a little better exposure to go proximally and allows you to do the anastomosis in the mediastinum. And reconstruction can be by pulling up the stomach if you have done a partial gastrectomy. If you have done a total gastrectomy with lower esophagectomy, then you have to put in a jejunal interposition loop. That can be isoperistaltic or that can be antiperistaltic. There is something known as a double track reconstruction you can do, which also helps in better drainage. So this is a review article of the Japanese Gastric Society, where they have just briefly mentioned the type of lymphadenectomy to be done and the surgical approaches. So if it is a Sievert's type 1, then you have to do a upper, middle, and lower mediastinal. So these are the they are always very aggressive about their lymphadenectomy. But in our country, very few people would do a upper mediastinal dissection for a Sievert's type 1. For a Sievert's type 2 also, they say that if the esophageal invasion is more than 3 centimeters, again you should do an upper, middle, and lower mediastinal clearance. If the esophageal invasion is less than 3 centimeters, then just the lower mediastinal group is enough. And even for a Sievert's type 3, which is mainly a gastric cancer, they are recommending that we do a lower mediastinal clearance, paraesophageal clearance, subcarinal clearance, which obviously is not done for a gastric cancer. So to simplify and say that treat a Sievert's type 3 as a gastric cancer is not entirely correct. You still have to do a little more extensive lymphadenectomy. You have to do a little more resection of the esophagus, and frequently the anastomosis will go into the mediastinum. You cannot manage just by doing an abdominal operation. So a Sievert's type 3 is managed like a gastric cancer, but not exactly like a gastric cancer. And the surgical approach for a Sievert's type 1 is a right thoracic approach, which is either the Ivor-Lewis or the McKeown's. Same with the Sievert's type 2. And for a Sievert's type 3, they are saying you can do a transhiatal approach, but you can also do a left thoracoabdominal. And the stations they have given, you need not remember these stations, I think. And the type of gastrectomy also. These are just the lymph nodal stations. Again, I have just put it up for the purpose of theory purpose or for the completion, but you don't have to remember what is 19, 20. 1 to 14 anyway you remember, because these are the common stations for gastric cancer. It's the same station, no different. But the mediastinal nodes, I don't think as general surgery PGTs you need to remember. If someone can remember, very good, no harm, but it is not a must. You will not fail if you don't say what is station number 110 or station number 108. What are the types of mediastinal lymphadenectomy? These are the number stations, but mediastinal lymphadenectomy is divided into 3 types. One is standard, one is extended, and one is total. So most commonly, what we would do for a Sievert's type 1 or type 2 would be a standard infrahilar dissection, which is the paraesophageal, lower paraesophageal nodes and the subcarinal nodes and the tracheobronchial nodes. Extended is infrahilar plus right recurrent laryngeal and right paratracheal, and total mediastinal dissection is infrahilar plus bilateral recurrent laryngeal and bilateral paratracheal nodes. Obviously, the more extensive lymphadenectomy you do, the more the chances of recurrent laryngeal nerve injury and more the chance of post-operative complications like aspiration pneumonitis. So lung complications are a common sequelae of thoracic operation. If on top of that you end up doing a damage to the recurrent laryngeal nerve, then there may be severe pulmonary complications in the post-op period, and the patient may need to be put on a ventilator and even die. So you have to keep it in mind. You have to balance the benefits of more extensive dissection with the risks of pulmonary complication. So this is an incision that is made for McKeown's transthoracic total esophagectomy. It's a right 5th posterolateral intercostal space incision for mobilization of the thoracic esophagus, an upper abdominal incision for the mobilization of stomach and disjunction at the lower end, and a left cervical incision for disjunction at the upper end. And the entire esophageal specimen is removed from the cervical up to the abdominal esophagus, and the stomach tube normally is pulled up. This is the extensive resection you can see. This is the upper cut margin. This is the lower cut margin. And this is the Ivor-Lewis esophagogastrectomy. This can be used for a Sievert's type 2 or even for a Sievert's type 3 if it is going significantly into the esophagus. So you make a right posterolateral thoracotomy in the right 5th intercostal space, and you make an upper abdominal incision. There is no cervical incision. And obviously the level of transection of the esophagus, upper esophagus, is somewhere here at the level of the arch of the aorta. It is not in the neck, and the stomach tube is pulled up, and intrathoracic anastomosis is done in this case. Okay. Whereas in case of a McKeown, it is a cervical anastomosis in the neck. In case of Ivor-Lewis, it is an intrathoracic anastomosis. So what are the choice of conduit after a total esophagectomy? Suppose you have done a total esophagectomy by a transthoracic route or a transhiatal route. Now you have to restore continuity. So the preferred conduit is a stomach because it has got a robust supply. You just need to do a single anastomosis. You take the stomach up and you join it to the neck, pharynx, and the continuity is restored. and the normal physiological pathway of the food from the pharynx to the stomach to the duodenum is maintained. But if the significant part of the stomach is reduced, or the stomach has had previous surgery, or the stomach is diseased due to concomitant other disease, and you cannot take up the stomach's residual stomach length is not sufficient to reach the neck, then you may have to take the colon. Left colon is preferred over the right colon because the size match, the caliber match is better, and the blood supply is a little more constant, more predictable. But the disadvantages are that 3 anastomoses are needed, because 1 anastomosis is the colon to the pharynx. The second anastomosis is the colon to the residual stomach or to the jejunum if the total stomach has been removed. And the third anastomosis is the colocolic anastomosis. Since you have removed a large segment of the colon, the right colon has to be anastomosed to the rectum. So you have to end up with 3 anastomoses. So that is a problem. So we don't prefer the colon normally, but if you cannot use the stomach, you have to use the colon. And if the colon is also diseased for some reason, the patient also has got diverticular disease, or the patient has had previous colonic surgery because of colon cancer, then you may have to use a jejunum, which can be a pedicle jejunum or a free jejunal flap because of microvascular anastomosis. What are the complications of surgery? Complications of surgery are immediate and delayed. The list, obviously, I will not go into the details because I think I'm running out of time. Delayed complications, pulmonary complications are very, very important. You have to do aggressive post-op chest physiotherapy. And this is Torek, who was the person who first did the transthoracic esophagectomy way back in 1913. And I'm happy to take any questions. Shall I stop sharing?
Saurabh,
Yes, sir.
thank you. Very nice, elaborate, and very clear-cut description, and you're giving a good understanding about the everything about the disease. Listen, thank you, and I think the recording will help also for further study and keeping the everything about the details what you have mentioned in describing the gastroesophageal junction carcinoma. I have learned a lot from your talk. And regarding one thing, Saurabh, my question is, if there is coexisting lesion at the gastroesophageal junction and in the antral part or the body part of the stomach, how do you classify that tumor? Recently I got a case, what I did in medical college, a gastrectomy, distal subtotal gastrectomy was done for a antral lesion, and the patient has developed a gastroesophageal junction tumor. I have sent it to your OPD in medical college. So how this tumor is to be classified? Initially, at the beginning, when endoscopy was done for the evaluation of the gastric carcinoma, there was some erythematous lesion at the gastroesophageal junction. Biopsy was taken at that time. There was no dysplastic change or anything, which there was suspicious clinically, but histopathologically there was no proof of malignancy. But after 8 months or 9 months, the patient had developed a obvious endoscopically and biopsy proved carcinoma at the gastroesophageal. How do you classify this type of lesion?
There are 2 discrete lesions, sir. They will have to be classified separately. The stomach lesion will be classified as a CA stomach, and GE junction tumor will be classified according to the AJCC criteria. It will be a synchronous double primary, and obviously the treatment will be very, very complicated because especially if it is a little higher up, if it is a Sievert's type 1 or 2, part of the esophagus will go. Because it is a body of the stomach lesion, almost the total stomach will go. So reconstruction will be a little challenging, very challenging, but
Another question, Saurabh. The number of lymph nodes is very important in describing, in staging the nodal status. Okay, and can you tell us, give an idea about what are the different types of malignancy in different parts of the body, where a number is sometimes considered, sometimes the size is considered, and sometimes the site is considered. Number, site, and size. Is there any rule?
Most of the cancers, we are moving away from site and size, and we are going to number. So if you see for breast cancer, we have gone to purely number Although for clinically we used to have solitary, but now it is just about number. Similarly, for stomach and esophagus, they have specified the number as a criteria, neither site nor size. And so you have to have at least 16 lymph nodes, because unless you get 16 lymph nodes, you will never get N3B. It is 15 or more than 15 lymph nodes. So unless you remove 16 nodes, how will the pathologist find 16 positive?
For colon, Saurav, for colon,
Colon also, sir, it is just purely number 1, 2, 3.
uh,
So it is, but head and neck, size criteria is still there. Location criteria is also there. If it is contralateral, then the staging is involved. If it is more than 3 centimeters or less than 3 centimeters, more than 6 centimeters, their size and site both have a
Okay, sir.
and other than head and neck, I don't think I can remember any other.
in breast cancer, you mentioned the number of lymph nodes, but regarding the fixity, is it still staying that fixity, not mobile and fixed?
But if they say perinodal extension, yes, PNE makes it in specific criteria. I mean, it does not change the N status, but PNE will mandate adjuvant radiation. But no, it does not change the N status. So fixity in itself does not, for pathological staging, it does not influence.
Clinically, N2 we say if it is fixed.
Used to say, sir, but nowadays for ultimately pathological staging, it will not matter. And the treatment decision will be based on pathological PTNM stage, not CTNM stage.
Okay, thank you, Saurav.
Okay, Saurabh, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having a nice overview of the G-junction tumor. And the idea of these lectures were to apprise student about how to write a good answer in a recent advanced section. So we are trying to cover the whole faculty, which have done a nice job taking from anatomy to the whole management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
I found no question in the chat box, so we can conclude. Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you very much.